So we're going to try to finish up chapter 10 today, which means next week, which is our last week, we have chapters 11 through 21, which is an impossibly difficult task. So I'm not exactly sure how I'll divide that out. I did promise some people I would talk about chapter 20. So probably what I'll do next week is just kind of do just a big jump between all of them and just kind of pick out this passage in chapter 12. There's a passage in chapter 17. I want to talk a little bit about the crucifixion, and there's a couple of them in chapter 20. We'll see. We'll see what we can do. So I only have 9 weeks to do the Gospel of John, and as you can see, we're not even doing every verse. There's just so much more in there, but we're just doing the best we can with what we have. So maybe I'll get voted in to teach again at some point. So all right, let's go ahead and get started. So last we left off at the end of chapter 8. Okay, we've had all of these series of misunderstandings that Jesus trying to explain that he is the Son of God, he is the Messiah, he's the promised Jewish Christ, and he has been appointed by God to be his agent, to represent him, and that God has highly empowered him, God has authorized him. But most of the Jews think that Jesus is either lying or making this up, or he's claiming to be the Messiah when really he isn't. Or some of them just think he's crazy. Some of them think that he's, a demon-possessed person, or that he's a Samaritan or whatever. And that's the main story of the Gospels. Actually, I kind of had this story with somebody, or this conversation with someone today, who was trying to understand. She asked me, why is it that the Christians don't like the Jews and the Jews don't like the Christians? And I said, well, it's kind of an oversimplification, but the basic story of the Gospels is that you have the Jewish Messiah being ironically rejected by the Jewish people. That's the irony of all four of the Gospels. They crucify him and they're like, oh, it's the King of the Jews, and they're mocking him. But as the reader, yes, he is the King of the Jews. And of course, obviously at the end of all the Gospels, God proves that Jesus really was the Messiah by raising him from the dead. I mean, if Jesus was a fake, God wouldn't have raised him. He would just left him in the grave. So, okay, all right. So we move into chapter 9. And in chapter 9, we're going to have another healing story, okay, just like we had in chapter 5. But also, like we had in chapter 5, Jesus does this on the Sabbath, okay? And he's already proven in chapter 5 that it's okay to do good on the Sabbath, because God does good, and Jesus, as the agent of God, is able to represent what God is doing. And so Jesus is able to do that on the Sabbath as well. But Jesus didn't learn his lesson when people got upset at him for healing on the Sabbath in the past. He was going to do it again. Okay, so that's what's happening. We get to chapter 10. We have to spend a little bit more time talking about the context because it talks about the Feast of Dedication. And I tend to find that most Christians have no idea what the Feast of Dedication is, because it's the one Jewish festival that's not explicitly talked about in the Old Testament, but it was developed in the intertestamental period. Okay, so let's talk about this passage here. And so Jesus heals the blind man. Okay, heals the blind man. And one of the things that you're going to notice in this story, just kind of understand the imagery that's going on here, is that Jesus is going to heal a guy who is physically blind. Now he's able to see, and his ability to see is going to be more than simply, I'm able to use my eyeballs and see what's going on. He's actually going to be able to see and discern who Jesus is Christologically. But the irony is that people in this, the Pharisees, who can physically see with their eyeballs, are going to look at Jesus and they're going to be blind about his identity. That's the irony of the story, is that we're dealing with blindness and seeing on multiple levels, okay? So again, I think I'm not really telling you anything that you can't really figure out yourself. But we're seeing how a miracle story raises the question of who Jesus really is, and how some people can recognize him, they see him, while others don't actually accept him. Okay, and you can see this is like the same story we have basically in every single chapter. Okay, it was the Sabbath on the day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. This is in chapter 9, verse 14. And the Pharisees also were asking him again how he received his sight. They're talking to the blind man that can now see. And he, the blind man, said to them, he applied clay to my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore, some of the Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God. They're talking about Jesus, the one who healed him. Okay, why is Jesus not from God? Because he does not keep the Sabbath. You see the perspective? Jesus really can't be a prophet or even God's Messiah if he's deliberately breaking the Sabbath. They think that he's deliberately just disregarding it. Again, from the perspective of Jesus, it's okay to do good on the Sabbath. Okay, it's okay to heal. All right? All right. But other Jews were saying, well, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? You see their perspective? They're saying, well, if he's a sinner, how is it that God's able to work through him and to do these miracles? They're saying, well, obviously, he's got to be important if God is doing these miracles through him. Okay? All right, so there was a division among them. Okay, there's a Christological debate that's actually taking place there. All right, so they said to the blind man again, what do you say about him? What do you say about Jesus since he opened your eyes? And he said, he is a prophet. Okay, that's true, but that's not quite enough. That's not enough. But it's interesting here that notice that if you are a prophet, you are someone that God can not only speak through, but also someone that God can work through and to do miraculous things. Okay, there's a presupposition there on what a prophet would actually mean. Okay, the Jews then did not believe it of him that he had been blind and had received his sight. Okay, so they're saying, okay, you're able to see, and you're claiming that this sinful person healed you. So we don't even actually believe that you were blind in the first place. You see how this, the domino just keeps getting pushed in the wrong direction. Okay, all right, until they called his parents, the very one who had received his sight, and they questioned them. They questioned the parents. Okay, passage goes on. The parents, they were afraid of the Jews. By the way, what is the ethnicity of the parents? What is the ethnicity of the parents? Are they Jews or are they Gentiles? They're Jews. Okay, so not a trick question. But I want you to see what's going on here. These Jews are afraid of other Jews. Why? Because the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed Jesus to be the Christ, that he was to be put out of the synagogue. Okay, this is an inter-Jewish debate, an inter-Jewish discussion. Okay, so we've got the Jews that are basically playing the role of the antagonist in the Gospel of John, but clearly the Jews are, where are they? They're the Pharisees. Again, the people that had taken control of Judaism after the destruction of the temple. Okay, all right, so what do we got in this particular story? Okay, first of all, the second time that Jesus healed on the Sabbath, and of course this has led to criticism of his messianic ministry. I mean, he's not doing a lot to put his best foot forward. I mean, he's doing things that knowingly he's going to bring about criticism about who he actually is. All right? But again, Jesus, I just want to make sure that we're clear on this, okay? Jesus is not sinning. He's not breaking God's law. He's not actually breaking the Sabbath. From the perspective of Jesus, he is not doing work. He's actually doing good on the Sabbath. And because God does good on the Sabbath, I mean, God creates people, he gives life, he gives breath, he gives oxygen, I mean, God does all sorts of things on the Sabbath. Jesus, as God's agent, has the authority to do good as well. Okay, so he's not breaking the Sabbath. He's not sinning. Okay, now I do think it's interesting here. You have two different groups of people that are trying to understand who Jesus is. Remember, one of them said, "This man's not from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath." Okay, so they think that he's deliberately breaking the Sabbath, thereby that disqualifies him from being a spokesperson of God. The other groups are saying, "Okay, well he did a real sign, he did a real miracle. How could that possibly make him a sinner? He must not really be a sinner." But here's the interesting thing. Both groups agree that he's a human being. This man, this human being, okay? How can a man who is a sinner perform such a sign? No one's disagreeing on that point. Everyone agrees Jesus is a human being, okay? The question is never, is Jesus really a human being or not? That's not the issue. The issue is, can a human being who claims to be sent by God, be God's agent, supposedly break the Sabbath? Okay? Or can a man who is performing signs really be identified as a sinner? Okay? But they all agree he's a human being. That's not, the question of his identity is not what's at stake. The question is, did God really send him? Okay? Is he a true prophet that God is really working through? Or is he a messianic pretender, someone that's just kind of making all this stuff up? Okay? I want you to kind of see that. Again, it's very simple to see, very easy to see. But both groups call him a human being. They use the Greek noun anthropos, which means a man, a human being. Okay, all right. We see that Jesus' healing leads to an ironic ending. This is going to be at the end of the story here, where the blind man recognizes who Jesus is, while those who are able to see are actually blind to Jesus' identity. That's part of the irony in the Gospel of John. And that, of course, was introduced to us in the prologue. Remember in the prologue where it says he came to his own and his own did not receive him. It introduces the irony there. And now we're seeing the irony with the double use of the word blind. Okay? And then I talked about this like, I can't remember, it was either like session 1 or session 2, where we have the synagogue expulsion that's actually taking place right here. And it seems that this is describing what the original readers of the Gospel of John were experiencing. They were Christians who were being kicked out of the synagogue. They were probably Jewish Christians who were no longer allowed to coexist with other Jews. They were being kicked out of the synagogue because they were Christians. Okay? And in order for the gospel writer to relate to their situation, he tells stories with Jesus having to deal with the same issues. How do we know this? Okay, I'm going to show you something really interesting. I want you to take your Bible because I didn't make a slide on this. But in chapter 9, starting in verse 30, chapter 9, verse 30, I'll give you some time to get there. Okay. That's in the New Testament, by the way. That's okay. I'm picking on someone that's my friend. So I don't want people online to think I'm mean. Okay. All right. John chapter 9, verse 30. The man answered and said to them, well, here is an amazing thing that you do not know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. Who's talking here? The blind man. Okay. Verse 31. We know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he hears him. Wait, who was talking in verse 30? The blind man. And then you had the first person plural jumping in here. The blind man now starts to speak in the first person plural. We saw this actually in chapter 3, where Jesus, one person, talking to Nicodemus, starts jumping and talking in the first person plural, and Nicodemus, one person, starts talking in the first person plural. Okay? Because the blind man is representing the Johannine community, the people to whom the Gospel of John was written, and now you can see it kind of like percolating through the story here. You got this representative story of this one person who is going to be kicked out of the synagogue representing a larger group of people there. But that jump there from one person to the first person plural is one of the dead giveaways there. And of course, you can trace it down there through verse 34, where it says they answered him. Again, now that's the response. They answered him. Okay? So a little bit more of a complex point there, but this issue here of the synagogue expulsion. It shows up also in chapter 12. It also shows up in chapter 16. Okay, so again, this is just kind of asking these sort of questions. Why was the Gospel of John written? What is its purpose? But the interesting thing about the story is that after they kick the guy out of the synagogue, who goes and sees him? Who goes to comfort him? It's Jesus. Okay, Jesus goes to comfort him. Okay, I want you to imagine if you are one of the original readers of the Gospel of John, okay, and you're trying to coexist with the Jews. Maybe you're trying to go to the synagogue maybe on Saturday. You're used to probably going to church on Sunday. They probably met on the first day of the week, and maybe you got family members that are in the synagogue. Okay, you're trying to convince them, but eventually they can't get along, and they say, "You're out of here. You're no longer welcome here. We're kicking you out. You're excommunicated." Okay, that's tough. That's emotionally tough. It's a sense of persecution. You're kind of being barred from this particular community. And then you see in a story that happened to someone else, and then Jesus goes to comfort him. And you're thinking, okay, if I'm being kicked out, I'm not being ignored because I know that Jesus actually is on my side. There's a sense in which the story is actually going to bring comfort to people that are going through the very same thing. So this is you might call it 4D chess if you understand that relevance. So, okay, so story picks up, okay? Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had put him out. The Jews, had kicked the blind man that was just given his sight out of the synagogue. He didn't do anything wrong. Okay? All right, but just because he believes that the one who healed him is actually, someone who is sent by God, they're like, well, that's what you believe. You're out of here. Okay? All right. So in finding him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and he is the one who is talking with you. Now, Jesus could have just said, he's the one who's talking with you. But you have both seen him. I bet that seeing has a double meaning. As in, You're looking right at him, but also you can perceive his identity. Because blindness in the Gospel of John is not just the inability to see, it's also the inability to recognize who Jesus is. All right? So, all right. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. The blind man, who now is able to see, I should just call him the formerly blind man, worshiped him. Okay. And Jesus said, for judgment I came into the world so that those who do not see may see. And those who see may become blind. But I don't think Jesus is actually taking away the sight of people. Okay? Those of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, we are not blind too, are we? Okay, again, they're not talking about the inability to see, it's the inability to perceive. Okay? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin, but since you say that we see, your sin remains. Okay, there's a sense of accountability that they have there. Okay, and that's the end of the story. Okay, so Christ goes to the aid of those who are persecuted, and we're going to see that this story is going to lead into chapter 10, where Jesus is going to claim to be the good shepherd who takes care of the sheep, who looks after his own, who knows their voice, and who calls them by name. Okay, so here you've got the one sheep that's been kind of kicked out who goes to take care of him, the shepherd. Okay, so we're seeing probably how this is intentionally moving into chapter 10 in the discussion of the Good Shepherd. Okay, so it's kind of an interesting question here. Do you believe in the Son of Man? That's not really something we see in the New Testament so often. It's really, do you believe in the Christ? Do you believe in the Son of God? But do you believe in the Son of Man stands out a little bit. It's not something we normally see here. And again, in the Gospel of John, Son of Man is more than simply the figure portrayed in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 through 14. That's a human being that represents the suffering people of God, highly authorized by God, that receives worship. That's what we see in Daniel 7, okay? In the Gospel of John, the Son of Man also functions as a revelatory figure that reveals the things of God to the people. We saw that in chapter 1. We saw that in chapter 3, verse 13. You can see it in a variety of places. Okay, so of course, believing in the Son of Man believes that, okay, he's, the human being that has been authorized by God, that's been empowered by God, that's a human being that is empowered by God to do all these great things, obviously healing and giving sight to the blind, but also the one that reveals God in a very tangible way, but as an authentic human being. Remember, they all agree he's a human being. No one questions that. Okay? He's God's highly empowered human agent who reveals God's truths to humanity. Okay. But what happens there is that he gets worshipped. Okay? Now, in our culture, we've got to make this point. In our culture, we tend to think that you only worship God. You only worship God. So, of course, if you see people worshiping Jesus, people will assume, okay, well, if you're only supposed to worship God and people are worshiping Jesus, they must assume that Jesus is God. The problem with that logic is that in the ancient world, God is not the only person whom you could worship. Okay? There are plenty of human beings in the Old Testament that not only receive worship, but they receive authorized worship. Like, God doesn't say it's wrong, it's not blasphemous, it's not a terrible thing. Typically, it's prophets and kings. And the best passage, if you could have one passage to show your friends this, or one passage to underline or highlight in your Bible, it's got to be 1 Chronicles 29:20. Okay? It's a good one to commit to memory, at least just the reference here. Because in 1 Chronicles 29:20, I want you to notice what happens. Okay? Doesn't matter what translation, they all basically say the same thing. So, high-ranking human beings could be worshipped. David said to the assembly, to the Jewish assembly, I guess the Israelite assembly, okay, now bless Yahweh your God. And all the assembly blessed Yahweh, the God of their fathers, and they bowed low and they did homage to Yahweh and to the king. Who is the king? King David. Okay? So all the people, notice two acts of worship. They bowed low and they did homage, not just to one object, to Yahweh, but to Yahweh and to the king. They worship God and a human being. And it's okay. It's fine. No one is stoned for blasphemy. You're not doing anything wrong, because it's okay to worship high-ranking human beings if God says it's okay, if God allows that, okay? So it's a great passage. So, of course, if they can worship David, a human being, how much more appropriate is it to worship Jesus the Messiah, both of whom are anointed by God, okay?
We also found that early on in the life of Christ, when he was a very young child, when the kings of the East
That's right.
came.
That's right.
had that interchange with the Roman official. And
Yeah. So I mean, Jesus gets worshipped, in his life, even prior to his resurrection, a few times.
For who
That's right.
who he is.
That's right. That's right. They worship a baby. They worship a baby. So that's or an infant, I guess you could call them. So that's just one of the things we need to understand. We need to understand that in the ancient world, it was okay to worship certain human beings if God has qualified them as worthy of worship. Okay. If you want another passage, you can just put this in your notes. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 9, that's where Jesus says that people are going to worship Christians one day. Revelation chapter 3, verse 9. Jesus says, I'm going to make these people that are persecuting you come and fall down at your feet. That's the basic verb for worship, the verb proskuneo. Okay? So, and if you wanted to, I can just give you a full list of all the people in the Old Testament that are worshipped. It's just one of these things that we have to understand, that just because Jesus is worshipped, it doesn't mean that he's divine. Okay? Because in the Old Testament, they worship kings all over the place. David, Solomon. And here's a great one, to where they're worshiping Yahweh and the king as the object of two verbs of worship. Okay, that's a big deal. So committing 1 Chronicles 29:20 to memory, I think is going to help you in some conversations. Any questions about the blind man story? Notice that the blind man is now able to see. He's also able to recognize who Jesus is. He's the Son of Man through whom God is doing these miracles, worthy of worship. But the Pharisees, who can physically see, but they don't recognize who Jesus is, they think that he's a sinful, Sabbath-breaking sinner. He says, oh, you're blind. Okay, so you can see how blindness and seeing works there. All right. Okay, so we move into chapter 10. Okay, so Jesus is going to claim two titles here. He's going to say, I am the door, okay, and I am the shepherd. Okay, is Jesus really a door? Is he made of pine? These are metaphors indicating something about him and how a door gives you access to something else. So if Jesus is the door, he is the door giving people access to God, obviously. Okay. And being the shepherd, now you might say, okay, well, the Lord is my shepherd, Psalm 23, that's true. But who is the famous shepherd king in the Old Testament? It's King David, okay? King David. All right. So here in chapter 10, verse 7, Jesus said to them again, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, and the sheep do not hear them. Okay, I want you to notice how the sheep are responding. Okay, the sheep don't hear them. The sheep don't hear these thieves and robbers. Okay, I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved, will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I come that they might have life, present tense, by the way, might have it in the present, and have it abundantly. Okay? And then he moves to the next metaphor. I am the good shepherd. All right? The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not the shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and is not concerned about the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, even as the Father knows me. And I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. How many times has he said that he's going to lay down his life for the sheep? Twice so far. I think actually the passage goes on. He says a few more times. Okay, so you got the metaphor of the door. You got the metaphor of the shepherd. Okay, so obviously as the door, Jesus functions as the locus of God's salvific purposes for the flock. That's just my fancy way of writing something greater than a 6th grade level. So Jesus is kind of the focal point of how God is working to deal with the flock. And of course, the flock is the sheep. The sheep are just God's people. They're guided by a shepherd. And again, famous shepherd from the Old Testament is David, who's not just a shepherd, he's also the shepherd king. What kind of king? The anointed king. So Jesus claiming to be the shepherd, and people are saying, oh, that in terms of David, that is also a veiled allusion to a claim to be the Messiah, being the anointed king. Okay, shepherd king. All right. Of course, we can't see any of these titles without seeing them drawing on passages formally talking about God's wisdom, because God's wisdom was always located at the door, at these public places. So here in Proverbs chapter 8, personified wisdom is poetically speaking in the first person. Blessed is the one who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting beside my doors. And in Greek, it's actually the very same word that's used here for I am the door of the sheep. Okay, almost as if the author here is drawing deliberately on the very same word for the door. Okay, whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from Yahweh. Okay, what happens? The one who goes in through the door, what happens? Jesus comes so they might have life. So you've got the theme of the door and life. Here you've got the door and life. And ultimately, finding it gets favor from Yahweh because Jesus, the door, is the one that gives access to Yahweh. Okay? Now, as the good shepherd, Christ lays down his soul for the sheep. I know it says life, lay down my life for the sheep, but in Greek it's the word psyche, the word for soul. Okay? So if Jesus' soul dies, what does that tell you about his soul? Does he have an immortal soul? No, obviously his soul is mortal. He's saying, I'm laying down my entire soul, because when a person dies, the soul dies, because you are a soul. Not that you possess a soul, you are a soul. Again, I already know that we know all this stuff right here, but it's sometimes it's helpful to see that even right here, I'll lay down his life, lays down his soul, lays down his entire self. I would almost prefer it if they just translated soul, so we actually get back to seeing how that language actually works. But it doesn't flow in English very well to say that Jesus pours out his soul unto death. He pours out his life unto death. But it's the word for soul in both places. Okay? So Jesus, even though he was highly empowered and highly authorized by God, he still had a mortal soul, like all of us do. Okay? All right. So the sheep, what happened to them? Okay? They don't listen to others, which actually implies that they do listen to the shepherd. Okay? And the shepherd knows his own. And there's a really interesting point, because in John chapter 20, you have the first person who sees Jesus raised from the dead. You know who that person is? It's not John, it's not Peter. They're the first witnesses of the empty tomb. But who's the first person to actually...
The lady.
But there's only one of them. There's only one lady. It's Mary. Which Mary is it? Is it his mother?
No.
Is it the sister of Martha? No, it's Mary Magdalene. We got to keep all these Marys in line, okay? There's either 3 or 4 Marys, depending on how you count them in the Gospel of John. So you got Mary Magdalene there. And one of the interesting things is that she shows up and she sees the resurrected Jesus, but she doesn't recognize him. But he knows who she is, because he calls her by name. Because the shepherd knows his own and he calls them by name. So the theme of the shepherd actually shows up later in John chapter 20 with...
Jesus made her an agent. You go and tell.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
She recognized his voice.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of interesting kind of like underneath the surface imagery that's going on there that we often just goes right over our head. We might spend some time next week and look at that. Okay. Of course, I already talked about how the theme of the door is drawing on the Jewish wisdom imagery, and also the theme of the shepherd, because the purpose of the shepherd is that you would listen to what the shepherd has to say. The sheep respond to the shepherd by listening to his voice. And of course, this is drawing on the fact that the ideal response to personified wisdom is to listen to her voice and to obey her in like a bunch of passages, like a couple times in Proverbs chapter 1, chapter 8, chapter 9. Anyway, by this time, you get that point there. Okay. Nothing he said at this point so far is controversial, I don't think. I mean, he's going on for a long time. Nothing super controversial just yet. All right. But that's going to change very quickly, because chapter 10 is one of these big controversy stories. Okay. At that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem, okay? And it was winter, okay? Now, what I tend to find, by the way, is that most people, when they're reading through the Gospel of John, they get to this verse, and they don't stop and say, I wonder what the Feast of Dedication is and why it's occurring during winter. They just kind of keep reading. But it's a really important piece of context that is going to explain the nature of the controversy later, and I'm going to prove it to you, okay? If you don't know what the Feast of Dedication is, I'll talk to you about it, all right? So, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon, okay? The Jews then were gathered around him and were saying to him, over and over and over again, not one time, they were saying to him, it's the imperfect tense, okay? How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Okay, so he's there in Jerusalem. He's already been in Jerusalem in chapter 5. and in chapter 7 going into chapter 8. So as far as the narrative is concerned, this is the third time. Actually, no. Chapter 2 also, where he cleansed the temple. Okay? So Jesus has been in Jerusalem and doing messianic miracles quite a lot. Okay? So it seems a little silly, like, if you really are, tell us. And he's like, I told you, and you don't believe. But the works that I do in my Father's name, these testify about me. Again, he continues to portray himself as the agent of the Father. He's doing the Father's works, the Father's miracles, his healings are on behalf of the Father. They testify about me. But if you don't believe you don't believe because you are not of my sheep. Again, the shepherd imagery here. My sheep hear my voice, meaning they obey me. Okay, if you are a sheep of Jesus, then you obey him. And I know them, and they follow me, and I give eternal life to them. They will never perish. No one can snatch them out of my hand. Verse 29. My Father, who has given them to me, who is the them? Who's the them? The sheep. Okay? How did Jesus get the sheep? The Father gave it. Okay? My Father is greater than all, including Jesus, obviously. And no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one. Okay, we'll talk about this. This is 10 verse 30. Okay, that of course leads to some controversy. All right, so Feast of Dedication. Okay, it's the festival of Hanukkah. It's not like the modern Hanukkah that they do. We do need to talk a little bit about how this came about. Okay, so in the year 171 BC, in the year 171, okay, you had the Jews that make a peace treaty with the nation to the north of them, which is it's the nation of Syria, but it's controlled by Greek kings. Okay, they make a peace treaty, and of course, the peace treaty is unfortunately a very liberal one. It basically says for the Jews that, well, they can't circumcise people and they can't observe the Sabbath and that sort of stuff there, and it's a kind of a compromising, Hellenizing agreement there. It's not good. Okay, and then about 3 years later, that gets broken. And what happens is, for a variety of reasons, a lot of like political stuff that's going on there over who's going to be the high priest, and there's a high priest that actually gets killed, guy named Onias, and we have one of the Syrian kings whose name Antiochus Epiphanes IV. We're just going to call him Antiochus IV. He sends his Syrian troops down there to kind of, smash out Judaism, and against all odds, this ragtag group of Jews actually defeats the Syrians, these Greek armies, pushes them out, and takes control of their land for the very first time, where they would have their own independence since Nebuchadnezzar brought the Babylonians down there in the 6th century. They get their own independence for the first time in like 500 years. It's huge. And one of the things that had happened during that time is that some of the Jews had allowed some of the Greeks to put an altar to Zeus Olympus in the Jerusalem temple on their altar. On the sacrificial altar, they put this statue to Zeus Olympus. One of the most like profane, disrespectful things you could do in the Jewish temple. So one of the things that the Jews had to do once they had control of their land is that they had to cleanse the temple. And when you cleanse the temple, you rededicate it to God, which is why it's called the Feast of Dedication. Hanukkah celebrates the time when the Jews gained their own independence because they decided, we're not going to compromise with Hellenism, we're not going to compromise with these Greeks, and we're going to do whatever we can to kind of push them out. All right, so it's a very, very interesting story. You want to read about it, you read 1st, 2nd Maccabees. Also, there are a lot of events that took place in it that are actually mentioned in a couple passages in the book of Daniel. I put them on the board there. Now, I know that's a little controversial because there are a lot of people in the church that have different views of the book of Daniel, but you'll be surprised.
That's 8 chapters.
It's not just that. It's in 7, 8, and 9, and also 11. So take that with a good study Bible and look at it with the history, and you're going to say, wow, a lot of these things are things exactly that Antiochus did in that particular time period. Okay.
Alexander the Great had died.
That's right. He had died. Okay. We won't spend all that time in there too. Okay. But this context, regardless of what you think of Daniel, this context is very important for the story because they're at a time once a year that they remember how they were faithful to God and they had pushed out Antiochus Epiphanes and his Greek armies from Jerusalem so they can rededicate the temple. Okay? One of the things you need to know is that Antiochus Epiphanes, Epiphanes is not his last name. Epiphanes is just a Greek phrase which means God made manifest. Okay? Is this person Antiochus, is he a humble person or is he a proud, arrogant person? Answer, he is a proud, arrogant person. When you name yourself, I am Antiochus, God made manifest, that means that, you think that you think you're hot stuff. Okay? All right. So you can understand that a lot of Jews didn't like this guy. They thought he was a pretty blasphemous, disrespectful person. Okay? Now, one of the things that happens is that we have this legendary tale of Antiochus right on his deathbed converting and repenting. And the words that are said by him, recorded in 2 Maccabees chapter 9, verse 12, most historians don't think this is real. It's just kind of legendary. He said, mortals should not think that they are equal to God. It's like, he goes from claiming to be God made manifest to kind of like this is his deathbed repentance. Really important, okay? Because what happens in this story, you have Jesus during the time of the Feast of Dedication where they're celebrating this great victory, and they celebrate it every single year, and they retell the story every single year. And what happens? Jesus does something, and they accuse him in chapter 10, verse 33, you are a man who is making yourself out to be God. When they know in that story, they're celebrating the time when they pushed out a guy who said that men should not think that they're equal to God. You see how you have to understand the whole context of the Feast of Dedication to understand this particular story. You can see why the Jews are on edge when Jesus is doing these sort of things. It's a really key important point of context that, again, just most people they overlook. I see people preach on this all the time and they don't even talk about it. Anyway, all right. So let's just kind of move on and look at some of the specifics of it. Okay. So Jesus says, where does he say it here? About his deeds. All right. The works that I do in my Father's name, they testify about me. Jesus performs deeds in the name of his Father. Again, he continues to say that he is the Father's agent. He's not saying, I'm doing these deeds of my own power and my own ability. He's not saying that. He's saying, I'm only doing it to represent God, to represent the Father. And it's his Father, my Father. Okay? And of course, if God is his Father, then Jesus is the Son of God, a title for the Messiah. Okay? Now let's make sense here of what Jesus is trying to do, because this is going to be another one of these characteristic points of the theme of misunderstanding. Verse 28. All right? Jesus says, all right, no one can take them out of my hand. Right there. Verse 29. No one can take them out of the Father's hand. By the way, just to make sure that we're clear, Jesus says, my Father is greater than all. Okay? Now, by the way, just a little footnote here. You might actually have, because there's a different way you can actually translate verse 29 to where it would say, what my Father has given me is greater than all, and no one can snatch them out of the Father's hand. So to where it's talking about what actually the Father has given to Jesus is greater than all. It's ambiguous. You might have a footnote that says that. So if your translation says that, I'm just at least talking about it. But the point there is that either way, Jesus is admitting that the Father has given things to Jesus. He's portraying himself as someone who has been authorized and empowered by God. He can only do what he's doing because God has given him permission to do it. The sheep are the ones that the Father has given to him. Okay? My Father who has given the sheep to me is greater than all. Okay? So he's not claiming to be equal to the Father. He's admitting the Father is greater than all, everyone. Okay? And then I and the Father are one, meaning I and the Father are united in mission and united in purpose. Okay? Now, unlike English, to where the number one really only has one meaning, okay? In Greek, the number one is an adjective, and it could be either masculine, it could be feminine, or it could be neuter. Okay? If the number one is masculine, it means one person who is male. Okay? Is Jesus saying I and the Father are one person? No, he's not. Okay? It could be feminine, meaning obviously he wouldn't be using the feminine there. Or it could be neuter, meaning I and the Father are one thing, as in we're united in mission and purpose. In the Greek, it uses the neuter number one, not the masculine number one. It's a very basic, like first semester Greek point that a lot of people just get wrong. And the key thing that you need to know is that later in John chapter 17, where Jesus is praying for his disciples, he prays multiple times that the disciples would be one in the same way that he and the Father are one. As in, he wants the disciples to also be united with Jesus in mission and in purpose. Let's make sure that we get those passages read very quickly here. Okay? So whenever you're reading John 10:30, you also want to go look at John chapter 17, where the same neuter number one appears. John 17, verse 11. I am no longer in the world, yet they themselves are in the world. And I come to you, Holy Father, keep them in your name, the name which you have given me. Why? That they may be one, even as we are. Father, protect them and keep them in your name so that they can be one in the same way that we are. Verse 22, all right? The glory which you've given me, I have given to them, so that they may be one, just as we are. Okay? And there's a couple other places where it happens as well. All right? So, but you can understand this is going to lead to misunderstanding, which is exactly what happens. So what happens? Verse 31. The Jews pick up stones again to stone him. Notice how Jesus responds, okay? He knows that he's saying something provocative. He knows that he's been misunderstood. Notice how he responds to this. I showed you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you stoning me? I bet he's saying that like tongue-in-cheek. You know, I showed you all these things from God, from the Father. For which of these good works are you stoning me? You know, it's hard to answer that question. All right? The Jews answered him, for good work we don't stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself out to be God. Remember what Antiochus said on his deathbed. Mortals should not claim to be equal with God. You can understand why they're on edge and upset during the time of the celebration of Hanukkah. All right. Does Jesus agree with this? Does Jesus agree that he is a man who's making himself out equal to be God? Does he say, right, you're correct, absolutely, well done? Does he say that? No, he doesn't. He corrects them in a very interesting way. Jesus answered them, has it not been written in your law, I said that you are gods? If he, God, called them gods, to whom the word of God came and the scripture cannot be broken, do you say of him, Jesus, whom the Father sanctified and sent into the world, you are blaspheming because I said that I am the Son of God? Now, when did Jesus claim to be the Son of God in this passage? Explicitly, not at all, but he has said, my Father, which indicates, of course, that he is the Son of the Father, he is the Son of God. Okay? But his claim to be the Son of God is the one whom the Father is working his miracles, through whom the Father is doing these good deeds, these good works, and the one that the Father has given the sheep into the care of Jesus the shepherd. Okay? It's all about Jesus being the agent of God. He's God's agent. He does it completely as a human being. Okay, so Christ's response to picking up the stones is to reaffirm that he is the agent of the Father's good works. He just reaffirms this. I'm an agent. He doesn't agree with them that they're equal or that whatever it may be. So here's the other thing too, is that in verse 33, I think it's verse 33 or verse 32, I'm not sure. They think that Jesus is making himself out to be God. And again, it's this making himself out. We saw that in chapter 5. Okay, we're going to see it at the accusation before he gets crucified. He made himself out to be the Son of God. Their accusations that Jesus is just a plain ordinary guy who is claiming something that doesn't really belong to him. They think that he's a fake. They think that he's a phony. They think that he's making all this stuff up here. But Jesus isn't making himself out to be anything. He is saying, God is working through me. God has sent me. I am God's agent. He's not claiming anything. He's not grabbing something that doesn't belong to him. He's saying, God's authorized me. God's given me permission. That's the difference. Okay. All right. So, of course, Jesus disagrees with their claim. And his whole point, though, and we're going to go back and look at the Old Testament reference here to make sure that we're clear on what Jesus is doing with the Old Testament and how he's making this argument. Jesus' argument is that if God can empower others with the title God, okay, if God can call other people gods, all right, then God can sanctify and send his Son as his agent. the Father has sanctified Jesus, as in God has, made him holy, which I think probably happened at the baptism, and sent him into the mission field, sent him into the world. I don't think this means sent him from heaven into earth, because remember, world in the Gospel of John is not the third rock from the sun. The world is the realm of creation that's in redemption, that's in need of redemption. Okay, sanctification at his baptism, where he receives the Holy Spirit, sent into the mission field. All right, so he's like, hey, if God can make these agents and call them God, and that's fine, then why are you upset that God has sanctified me and sent me in, and I'm just coming to be the Son of God? I'm not doing anything wrong there. All right. But here's the interesting thing, and this is really important for later. We'll look at this next week in John chapter 20. Jesus agrees it is acceptable for God to appoint agents and actually to call them God. And we're going to look at this in Psalm 82, verse 6. We're doing our time. We're doing fine on our time. That's good. Okay. By the way, I can't remember when this was. Back like probably like 9 months ago, when we were going through the various doctrines of God, and we're talking about how God has agents, and we looked at all these texts to where in the Old Testament, human beings who were agents of God were called God, okay? I have an entire chapter in the book that's going to talk about all of them and document all of them so you can see, but here's one of these passages to where, from the perspective of Jesus, human beings who are agents of the true God can be called God in their role as God's agents, all right? So let's look at Psalm 82 and see how this is working. It's short. It's only 8 verses. There is some disagreement as to who's being described in this, but I think what Jesus is doing is I think that Jesus is understanding the reference here to human judges who represent God and they judge on God's behalf. I think that's how Jesus understands this, but I'm admitting to you there is open debate on this topic. Okay, so Psalm 82, all right, a Psalm of Asaph. God takes his stand in his own congregation. He judges in the midst of the rulers. But your footnote will say that literally it's the word gods. God judges in the midst of these, whoever these people are that he's calling gods. Gods is almost too raw, so they translate it as rulers. Okay, it's the word Elohim. And this is what God says. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Again, this is why I think that he's talking to human judges. Okay? What are they supposed to do? Vindicate the weak and the fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them out of the hand of the wicked. This is what judges are supposed to do. Okay? And then the narrator's like, they don't know. They don't understand. They walk about in darkness. And then look at the poetry that's here. What happens when judges don't do what they're supposed to do? All the foundations of the earth are shaken. Do you read that literally? You interpret that literally? When judges don't do what they're supposed to do, it is an earth-shattering event. Okay? When human rulers are not doing what they're supposed to do and God intervenes to judge, all the foundations of the earth are shaken. Okay? So we got to be careful when we read earthquake language and poetry and not necessarily read it literally. Okay? Especially when it's dealing with the overthrow of various leaders. Okay. I said, God, you are gods. All of you are sons of the Most High. So, of course, this is the part that Jesus quotes. Did not God say, I said, you are gods? And notice also they are sons of the Most High. What did Jesus claim to be? I was sanctified and sit in the world, and I'm just claiming to be the Son of God. These people right here, sons of the Most High. Okay? Nevertheless, you're going to die like men. You're just going to die like regular mortals. You're going to fall like one of the princes. And then we have kind of the summons from the psalmist. Arise, O God, you judge the earth, for it is you who possess all the nations. Okay. Point here is you got a rebuke of what I think are human judges who are doing a bad job. They're not judging correctly. They're not judging. They're not vindicating the weak or the fatherless. They're not doing justice to the afflicted. You can see they're not doing the things that they're supposed to do. Okay, all right. And yet God says, "Look, you're judging on my behalf. I'm even going to call you gods. I'm going to call you God. That you're representing me, and you're going to bear my title, God. They're not just called God once, twice. Verse 1 and verse 6. It's already there in the Old Testament. Okay." So we already see here, Jesus says, has it not been written in your law, I said you are gods, and if God called them gods to whom the word of God came, why are you upset that the Father has sanctified and sent me into the world, and I'm just claiming to be the Son of God? But here's the key point. is that Jesus seems to think it's okay for human beings to be called God in their role specifically as agents. Do you understand that? Okay? Jesus believes
It's a title.
as a title. That's right. That's right. Okay. So in the Gospel of John, is it possible for human beings to be legitimately called God in a way that God approves? The answer is yes. Did Jesus teach this? Yes. Okay?
Claiming to be God.
Right. They're agents of God's whatever role they're put in. Okay? So if at the end of the Gospel of John, at the resurrection, if they actually called Jesus God, there are two possible ways to interpret it. Are they God's agents in the way that Jesus approved of and quoted and affirmed? Or are they saying that Jesus is the only true God? I think it's unlikely that he's the only true God. I think it's this other one, okay? So again, the way that Jesus is quoting Psalms 82 and using it affirms that he believes that God can authorize human agents and call them God as agents without confusing them with the true God. There's no confusion here. God takes his stand and he judges in the midst of these human rulers that are called gods. Okay? There's no confusion there. We can see that. We get it. Okay? But again, if this is what Jesus believes and taught, then this should be part of at least how we understand how God uses agents.